Okay, so this is your typical rose bush. It's not a tea rose or a grandiflora. This is actually a shrub rose. And you do trim these a little differently than you would a tea rose or a grandiflora. And I just happen to have both in my yard, so we're going to start with the shrub version first. And as you can see, it's in dire need of a little bit of a haircut. Now with rose bushes, you basically want to trim off the tips and the ends. You don't cut these all the way back like you would a normal tea rose or grandiflora. So I'm going to go through here and just demonstrate for you how to do that, and then we'll move on to a typical tea rose or grandiflora rose. So here we go. Now I do not recommend trimming these unless you have a pair of gloves and some sleeves on so that you don't get bit. So here we go. Typical end like this, you can see where there's lots of new growth, and what I'm going to do is find like the outside leaf or a leaf node that is pointing to the outside of the shrub, and then I'm just going to snip it just like that. Now it is a myth that you should be trimming these on an angle. Actually you want it to be a straight cut so that the stem is not exposed to water and disease, and the less it's exposed, the less it is apt to catch a disease or some kind of mold or fungus or something on it, which is a big problem for us here in the Northwest. So then you just go through and you just trim to the outside edges. Now if you have some dead stems in there, those of course need to be cut off. You can see there's some old rose hips and stuff that I left on here, and that's always a good idea not to trim your shrubs, your rose bushes anyway, in the fall. Let the rose hips stay on there, and that kind of tells the plant that it's time to go to sleep and stop growing. If you were to come out here in the fall and start trimming off the tips, it's going to tell it, oh goody, I get to keep growing, which is not what we want them to do. We want them to stop for the fall. And these guys have just got tons of new growth on them. Now in order to even him out so that I have a nice even top to him, I'm going to trim this off as soon as I find an outside leaf node. There we go. And just trim that off so that he's a little more even. Yeah, you just go to the tips on a rose bush like this. There's no need to whack them all the way back. And what this is going to do is tell it, hey, it's time to bush out. And that's exactly what it'll do. Now if you've got crossing stems that are crossing into the center of the shrub like this, trim it back to an outside leaf node, of course. So any branches you've got crossing should get whacked off, like this guy who's crossing right through the center, and I'm just going to go right to the stem on this one and cut it off. It's really easy peasy, nothing complicated. Trim him back just a little bit more there. I have some more crossing branches right here, so I am actually going to go down to where those two are sticking out and cut that off. And what that does is it helps open up the center of the shrub, so it's getting light and air. And I'm going to cut off some of the old dead ones down here at the bottom. This is normal, by the way, for rose bushes to do this. And that is almost all there is to it. This is another transplant from my old property. Absolutely in love with this thing. And it just blooms its little heart out all summer long. And I will come back later, probably in April, and I will dig around the bottom of it and put in a slow release fertilizer that's specifically made for roses. Roses are very hungry plants. Once they start blooming, they need to be fed at least a couple times. I usually feed them once in April and then again in June, and that's usually about all they need for the rest of the growing season. But that just keeps them healthy, and of course it keeps them just putting out blooms one after another. But just like tomato plants, they put so much energy into making their flowers that you gotta feed them. You gotta give them some food. And they will definitely reward you for it. Okay, so we'll come back here in another month or so, and I'll show you some more pictures. of how he looks now that he's all budded out. But there you go. That's how you trim a rose bush. Your climbing roses, pretty much the same rules apply, where you just trim off the edges. You don't want to trim them all the way down, especially when you took so much time to get it trained on a trellis. And it will start to come back. All right, off to tea roses. Okay, so here's your typical tea rose. I'm so fortunate to have a little sunshine out here today. And here's how we're going to go about cutting those. So many people are intimidated by rose bushes, and honestly, they're just a bush. So don't be intimidated. As long as you're wearing long sleeves and gloves, it won't bite you. That's the only intimidation I can think of. But here we go. Here's your typical rose bush. He actually fared very well during the winter. I don't see a whole lot of dead canes in it. Those are usually the first things I look for. As you can see, there's a ton of new growth on here. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to go about halfway down this shrub till I find an outside leaf node, and I'm whacking them all the way down, just like this. And that's going to encourage a lot of that beautiful new growth to come out. Here we have some gangly ones, so I will whack those back too. Even though they have some leaves on them, it's perfectly okay. This is just going to encourage them to make more. The more stems they make, the more roses you're going to have. And of course, I'm going to move some of the mulch away from it. So much ground cleanup to do here. I just want to get out here and demonstrate to you how to cut back a rose bush. A few little dead things in here. Now where we live, rose bushes are very susceptible to black spot, which is a fungus. All those black spots you start seeing showing up on your leaves, and that's usually a very typical thing to have start happening if you're getting a lot of rain in the spring. All the more reason to cut these back, just like I did here. And black spot will kill a plant eventually if you let it go, but usually what I do is just trim them off. And the secret to not getting black spot in the first place is by keeping the grounds underneath the bushes clean. Right now I've moved all the mulch and everything away just because I know we're going to get a ton of rain, and it can really use the air and the sunlight. And the more air and warm sun that it receives, the quicker it's going to come back and start putting on its leaves and start some serious growth. Especially once I come back and start putting some slow release fertilizer on it for the summer. So that's all there is to it. Rose bushes are not to be intimidated or be intimidated by. They're just a shrub like anything else, and they're actually a lot hardier than people give them credit for. It's a matter of trimming them properly and keeping the ground clean around the bottoms of them. And then of course as they start to bloom, and of course I will come back later when we have some blooms going on, and I'll show you how to go about cutting the roses so that you can actually bring them inside and enjoy them. And every time you trim them during the spring and the summer, it just encourages them to make more, especially if you stay on top of the fertilizing. And of course the watering. Very hungry plants. I can't reiterate that enough. So you definitely want to feed them at least twice with a slow release fertilizer, probably one that's specially made for rose bushes. Has the right nutrients so they'll keep sending out blooms for you. And piece of cake. Nothing to it. Okay. And we'll talk next week. Bye for now.